sun had already begun its slow descent behind the jagged hills, spilling golden rose over the wide Wyoming sky. Dust shimmered in the dying light, and the wind carried that soft hum of summer, the sound of the earth breathing after a long, hard season. Clara McAllister stood by the split-rail fence at the edge of her land, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the trail that wound down from the ridge. She had been waiting all afternoon, though she wouldn't have admitted it aloud. Each time the wind stirred the tall grass, her heart gave a tiny start, expecting to see the rider appear from behind the ridge. For months she had imagined what that moment might look like. Now, as the sun burned low, she wondered if she'd imagined too much, asked too much of a man who'd already given everything to the land and the dust. Then she saw him at first. It was only the glint of sunlight off a belt buckle, the silhouette of a horse and rider cresting the horizon. But she knew, even at that distance, even through the haze of dusk, she knew the shape of his shoulders, the way he rode, half slouched, half proud, like the trail was an old enemy he'd learned to live with. Her breath caught. The shawl slipped from her shoulders, forgotten. Her hands gripped the fence post, as if it were the only thing keeping her from running down the path to meet him. Behind her, two small figures appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse. Ellie, the older of the girls, held her sister May's hand. Their faces were smeared with flour and curiosity. "Mama." Ellie's voice was small but clear. "Who's that comin' down the road?" Clara turned, her voice soft but trembling. "That's your PA girls." May echoed, blinking up at her. She'd been so young when Hank left that the word felt like something out of a bedtime story. They stood together in the fading light, the wind playing with their braids and skirts. As the rider drew closer, the shape of him became clearer, his coat worn thin, his hat pulled low against the sun, the horse beneath him, tired but steady. Hank McAllister, the man she'd loved since before she knew what love could cost. He dismounted slow, as if each movement was a conversation between pain and pride. Dust puffed up around his boots when they hit the ground. His horse, an old bay named Dusty, tossed its head once and snorted softly, the kind of sound that felt like home. Hank didn't speak at first. He just stood there, one hand on the saddle horn, the other gripping the top rail of the fence. He looked older, leaner, harder around the edges. His eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, but Clara saw enough to know they still held the same steady warmth. "Hank," she whispered, and the name seemed to lift from her lips like a prayer finally answered. He leaned one arm over the top rail, his other boot braced against the bottom slat. "Clara," he said quietly, "didn't reckon I'd ever see this gate again." "Well," she said, forcing a small smile, "you always did have a habit of comin' home later than you promised." He chuckled, low and rough, the sound of gravel in a dry creek bed. Trails longer when you're ridden with regret for company. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them filled with the years they'd lost, the words never sent, the nights she'd waited by the window, the letters she'd written and torn apart before dawn. Then Clara reached across the gate, her fingers brushing his. The wood was rough beneath her hand, but his skin was rougher, calloused, weather-beaten, real. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed the simple weight of his touch. "You came back," she said softly, her voice shaking despite her strength. Hank met her gaze. "Told you I would. You told me a lot of things, Hank McAllister." He tilted his head, half a smile ghosting across his lips. "Yeah, and I meant every one of 'em." Behind her, Ellie tugged at her mother's dress. "Mama, is he really stayin' this time?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, to promise her girls that the man before them wouldn't vanish with the next sunrise. But she'd learned better than to promise what the prairie might take away. "We'll see, sweetheart," she murmured. Hank crouched, resting his arms on the top rail so he could meet their eyes. "You two grown near a foot since I left," he said with a grin. "Didn't think it was possible you could get prettier." but I stand corrected." Ellie giggled, shy but proud. May hid behind her sister, clutching a small rag doll. "You smell like horses," she whispered. "That's 'cause I've been riding one for near 2 weeks straight," he said. "Ain't much bathwater on the trail." They all laughed, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The sound of joy returned to the land. Clara studied him quietly, the dust clinging to his coat, the small rip near his shoulder, the faint scar under his beard. He had lived hard, fought harder, but something in his eyes told her he'd come back for more than rest. "You eat yet?" she asked. "Got stew on the stove. Ain't much, but it's hot." He hesitated, fingers tightening around the fence rail. "You sure you want me crossin' this gate, Clara?" Her eyes softened. "You think I waited all this time just to leave you on the other side?" The wind carried the smell of the sage in the coming night. The last streaks of sunlight burned orange across the plains as Hank swung open the gate and stepped through. It creaked like an old memory, slow and stubborn, before closing softly behind him. When his boots met the soil of his home again, he seemed to breathe deeper, like the air itself forgave him. He took her hand, properly this time, holding it with both of his. "Didn't think I'd have the right to stand here again." She looked up at him, eyes shining. "The right's not something you lose, Hank, just something you have to earn again." The girls ran ahead, laughing toward the house. Their small footsteps stirred the dust, and for a moment, Hank watched them in silence, that kind of silence that belongs only to fathers, who realize how much they've missed, as they walked toward the porch. Clara glanced back once more at the gate, the wooden boundary that had kept out more than cattle. It had held back words, fears, and years of waiting. Now it stood open, swinging lightly in the evening wind. At the door, Hank paused. "You painted the shutters," he said quietly. "Didn't want the place looking sad when you came home," she replied. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "Looks beautiful. Always did." Inside, the scent of stew and firewood filled the small kitchen. Hank hung his hat on the hook by the door and ran a hand through his hair, uncertain, humble. The home was both familiar and foreign, like a dream remembered halfway. Clara handed him a bowl and sat across from him. The girls whispered and giggled in the corner, too excited to eat. For a while, no one spoke. The clink of spoon on bowl, the crackle of the fire, the steady breathing of people trying to remember what together felt like. Finally, Hank set his spoon down. "Clara," he said, voice low, "I made mistakes out there, plenty, but every mile I rode, I kept thinking of this, of you, of the girls, of that damn gate. It's what kept me going." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "Then let's leave the gate open this time." He nodded, his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "Reckon I can do that." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. The land was dry, cracked, hungry, but under the gathering clouds, it waited, patient as love itself. And as night settled over the McAllister ranch, the old gate swayed gently in the breeze, no longer a barrier, but a promise. Longer a barrier, but a promise. The rain came before dawn. It wasn't much, just a whisper against the windows, a promise rather than a downpour, but to the land, it was enough. The smell of wet earth crept through the open window, and the soft hiss of rain wrapped around the house like an old lullaby. Hank woke before anyone else. Years on the trail had carved the habit deep into him. Rise with the first light. Listen to the wind before the world began to move. He sat at the edge of the bed, boots on the floor, staring at the faint outline of his hat hanging by the door. Clara still slept, her face turned toward the wall, one hand curled under her cheek. In the quiet flicker of the dying fire, he studied her, the silver in her hair that hadn't been there when he left, the faint lines near her mouth that told stories of worry, laughter, and waiting. He thought about touching her shoulder, saying something simple like, "Good morning," or "I missed you," but words felt too small. So he stood instead, pulling on his coat and stepping out into the rain. The air was cold, sweet with the scent of sage and wet dust. The horizon blurred into pale gray, and beyond the barn, a thin mist hovered over the low pasture. The gate, that same gate, stood open, swinging slightly with each sigh of wind. Hank smiled to himself. He walked toward the corral, the old boards creaking under his boots. Dusty, his horse, lifted its head and snorted. Hank patted the animal's neck, whispering, "We made it back, boy. Don't that beat all?" Behind him, the house door opened. Clara appeared on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loosely tied back. "You've been up since sunup," she called. "Coffee's on." "Figured I'd check the fence first," Hank said, glancing over the wet fields. "Looks like the north side Sagan." Clara smiled faintly, still fixing fences before breakfast. Old habits die hard. They shared a silence, the kind that isn't heavy, just full of things neither quite knows how to say. Then she stepped down from the porch, crossing the yard barefoot through the damp grass. "You don't have to work the land your first day home," she said gently. "It'll wait. It's waited this long." He shrugged, but his voice softened. "Ain't the land I'm fixing to prove myself to." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and for a heartbeat, they were young again, standing under the same sky, with the world wide open before them. But the moment broke when the sound of hooves echoed down the trail. Hank turned sharply, eyes narrowing. A single rider approached, a dark figure against the morning mist. The horse moved fast, and something about the rhythm of its gait set Hank's nerves on edge. Clara's voice dropped. "You expecting someone?" He shook his head. "No." "Mom." The rider slowed as he neared the gate, a tall man in a duster coat, his hat low, his face hidden in shadow. Hank moved instinctively, placing himself between Clara and the road. When the rider dismounted, mud splattered his boots. He looked up, and Hank felt the old world tighten around his ribs. "McAllister?" the man said, his voice like flint on stone. "Didn't think you'd be fool enough to come back here." Clara froze. "You know him?" "Yeah," Hank said quietly. "That's Silas Boone." The name alone seemed to draw the air out of the morning. Silas had been his partner once, back when the two of them rode freight for the Union Army, long before the war ended and the desert took half their souls. They'd worked the same trails, fought the same men, and nearly died side by side, until greed and gold drove them apart. "What do you want, Boone?" Hank asked, his tone calm but tight. Boone spat into the dirt. "You owe me, McAllister. Don't act like you don't remember." "I don't owe you nothin'," Hank said, "not after what happened at Red Mesa." Clara stepped forward, but Hank's hand shot out, stopping her. His voice softened. "Go back inside, Clara." She hesitated. "Hank, please." Her eyes locked with his for a moment, then she nodded slowly and gathered her shawl, retreating toward the porch. Boone watched her go with a grin that Hank didn't like one bit. "Pretty as ever," Boone muttered. "Didn't figure you'd have the guts to come back to a woman like that, not with my name hanging over you." Hank's jaw tightened. "You best mind your tongue." Boone laughed. "Still got that temper. Ain't changed much, have you?" He reached into his coat, pulling out a folded piece of paper, crinkled and rain-stained. "This here's what you owe. $200 and a cut of what you stole." "I didn't steal a damn thing." "Then how come I was the one left to bury the bodies while you rode off with the pack horse?" Hank's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "You know damn well what happened that night." Boone's grin vanished. "Yeah, I do. You ran." The rain had started to fall again, thin, cold lines of silver cutting through the tension. Dusty shifted uneasily, hooves stamping the wet ground. Finally, Hank spoke, steady as a church bell. "You ride back to town, Boone. Tell whoever's still listening that Hank McAllister's done with the past. There's nothing for you here." Boone's eyes flicked to the farmhouse. Maybe not for me, but maybe for the law. He swung back onto his horse. I'll be seeing you, McAllister. Ain't no man outrun his own trail. As he galloped away, the sound of hooves faded into the rain, leaving silence behind. Thick and restless. Clara came back down the steps. Hank, what did he mean by all that? Hank didn't look at her right away. He leaned against the fence, water dripping from his hat brim. It's a long story. Then start telling it. He sighed, wiping the rain from his face. Back before the war ended, me and Boone hauled freight for a man named Kavanaugh. Government contracts, gold shipments, supplies, sometimes things better left unnamed. One night, we got ambushed near Red Mesa. Boone got greedy, started shooting his own men. I tried to stop it. Next thing I knew, 3 men were dead. Boone disappeared, and I was left with a horse and a pack I didn't ask for. And now he wants revenge, Clara said quietly, or money. Men like Boone don't care which. She crossed her arms. You should have told me. Didn't reckon I'd be bringing the past home with me. For a while, neither spoke. The rain eased into a mist, the clouds breaking apart to reveal a sliver of blue. Then Clara stepped closer. You gonna run again, Hank? He turned, startled. What? You heard me. If that man comes back with trouble, you gonna leave us to face it alone? Hank met her gaze, and for the first time since he'd returned, he didn't look away. No, Clara, I'm done running. Not from him, not from you, not from any of it. She studied him for a long, silent moment. Then she nodded once. Then we'll face it together. The wind shifted, carrying the faint cry of a hawk over the valley. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again. Soft and warning, Hank looked toward the horizon, the road he'd ridden so many times before. The trail stretched far, but now it felt different. For the first time in years, it wasn't calling him away. It was daring him to stay, and stay he would. As the rain faded into sunlight, Clara slipped her hand into his. The land steamed with the scent of renewal, and the open gate swayed gently once more. A line crossed, a past faced, and a promise unbroken. The storm left behind a silence that felt almost holy. By noon, the rain had washed the air clean, and the plains stretched wide and golden beneath the sunlight. Puddles shimmered in wagon ruts. The smell of cedar smoke drifted from the chimney. Clara stood by the window, watching the horizon the way she had for years, half in fear, half in faith. The children played quietly near the hearth, their laughter soft and uncertain, as if they too sensed that peace was only resting, not permanent. Hank was outside. From the window, she saw him working the corral fence again. Sleeves rolled up, hammer swinging in rhythm. He worked the way he always had, steady, deliberate, like a man trying to rebuild not just wood and wire, but something deeper. Every so often, he'd stop and look down the trail. The same trail Boone had ridden out on 2 days ago. He hadn't said much since that morning, only that he'd stay close, keep watch, and fix what was broken, one thing at a time. When Clara brought him water, he looked up and smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes softening. You didn't have to. She handed him the tin cup. You always say that, but I always do. He took a sip, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked toward the fading clouds. Feels like the world's trying to start over. Maybe it's telling us we can, too, she said quietly. He didn't answer, but she saw something in his eyes, that old mix of longing and guilt, like he'd never fully stopped running, even when his boots were still. That evening, as the sun sank low and turned the sky into fire, they sat together on the porch. The girls had fallen asleep early, their small hands curled around worn dolls, their dreams light. Clara rocked in her chair. Hank leaned against the rail, hat tilted low. The land stretched out before them, endless and calm. You think he'll come back? she asked finally. Hank didn't lift his head. Boone, maybe. Men like him don't rest easy, and if he does. He looked at her then, the dying light cutting lines of gold across his face. Then I'll be ready. She studied him for a long moment. I believe you. The crickets began to sing in the tall grass, and for a while they said nothing more. At dawn the next day, Hank saddled Dusty. Clara appeared in the doorway, hair braided, shawl tied around her shoulders. You going somewhere? He tightened the cinch and nodded. To town. Need to find out what Boone's been staring up. Can't wait for trouble to come knocking on our door. She hesitated. You sure it's wise, Hank? You barely just got home. He stepped closer, resting a hand against her cheek. I gotta do this, Clara. I'm tired of ghosts following me around. Time to face one in daylight. Her hand caught his wrist. Then promise me something. He smiled faintly. What's that? Come back. I aim to. He mounted up, the saddle creaking beneath him. As he turned down the trail, he glanced back at her, at the girls in the window, at the land that was finally starting to feel like his again. Then he touched his hat brim and rode on. Town was 30 miles of hard trail and harder memories. By the time Hank reached Dry Creek, the sun was high and merciless. The place hadn't changed much. A few new faces, a new sign above the saloon, but the same smell of dust, whiskey, and gun oil in the air. He tied Dusty outside the sheriff's office and stepped in. Sheriff Tucker looked up from behind his desk, pipe dangling from his mouth. Well, I'll be, Tucker said, if it ain't Hank McAllister. Thought you'd died out past the Rio Grande. Almost did, Hank replied. You seen Silas Boone around? Tucker frowned. Boone? Yeah. Rode through 2 nights ago. Asked a lot of questions about you. Claimed you owed him something. I don't owe him a damn thing. Didn't reckon you did. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. But he's been stirring up talk. Told a few men you was wanted in 3 counties. Hank's jaw tightened. I cleared all that up years ago. I know it. But some folks don't care about truth. They care about gold. Boone says, there's a bounty on you, and if he can't claim it legal, he'll claim it lead. Hank's eyes hardened. Then it ends here. Tucker sighed. Don't go starting a war in my town, Hank. I ain't starting nothing. Just finishing it. He turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. Hank found Boone where he knew he would, at the saloon, leaning over a table with 2 drifters' cards in one hand, whiskey in the other. Boone looked up as Hank entered. Well, hell, the ghost shows up. Time to settle it, Hank said. The saloon went still. Even the piano stopped. Boone smiled thinly. Out in the street then? Hank nodded. The men rose. Chairs scraped. Boots thudded. The door swung open, letting in the glare of noon sun. They stepped into the dust, the town watching from porches and windows. A dry wind stirred between them. Boone flexed his fingers near his holster. You sure about this, McAllister? Could still walk away. Been walking long enough. Boone's grin vanished. So be it. The street exploded in thunder. 2 shots, sharp, echoing between the buildings. One hit the ground. The other hit Boone square in the chest. He staggered, looked down at the spreading stain, then up at Hank. Guess you got faster, he muttered, and fell. The wind carried away the gun smoke. For a long moment, Hank just stood there, his gun still raised, his breath steady. Then he holstered it, turned, and walked back toward Dusty. Sheriff Tucker met him halfway. You all right? Never better. The sheriff nodded toward Boone's body. That old trail finally done. Hank looked toward the open road, then at the sky. Yeah, it's done. When he rode home that night, the sky was burning orange over the hills. Clara saw him first, a lone figure against the setting sun. Slow and tired, but upright. She ran out to meet him, the girls at her heels. He dismounted. boots hitting the dirt softly, and before he could speak, she threw her arms around him. He held her close, the smell of her hair mixing with the scent of dust and sweat and freedom. "It's over," he whispered. She leaned back, eyes shining. "You're home now." He nodded. "For good." They stood there as the wind rose through the valley, stirring the dry grass and carrying away the last echoes of gunfire. The land stretched out before them, wide and forgiving. The gate creaked softly behind them, swinging open in the breeze, no longer a barrier, but a passage. Clara took his hand. "Come on in, Hank. Supper's getting cold." He smiled, that slow, rare smile of a man who's finally made peace with the world, and together they walked back to Ward, the light spilling from the house. The dust settled. The sun sank, and for the first time in a long time, Hank McAllister didn't look back. Hank McAllister didn't look back.